At the beginning of the 1930s, Spain was immersed in a process of accelerated and deeply conflictive transformation. The proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931 had generated hopes for modernization, but it had also unleashed social forces that had been in conflict for generations. As the years leading up to 1936 progressed, the country experienced increasing political polarization expressed in massive strikes, attacks, street clashes, and a radicalization that divided society into irreconcilable blocs. The Republic sought to reform the structures of the state, but each attempt at modernization was perceived by one sector as a threat and by another as insufficient, feeding a climate of constant tension. The initial reforms of the government of Manuel Azaña, such as the modernization of the army, the secularization of the state, agrarian reform, and the autonomy statutes, generated rejection among conservative sectors, from large landowners to ecclesiastical and military hierarchies. At the same time, broad working-class sectors considered that these reforms advanced too slowly, especially in rural areas where the distribution of land remained extremely unequal. This double pressure opened a gap that widened with each new measure. Landowners feared a social revolution, day laborer peasants demanded progress toward real redistribution, and urban labor movements demanded rapid improvements in working conditions and wages. In 1932, one of the first signs of military fracture occurred, the uprising of General José Sanjurjo, known as the Sanjurjada. Although it failed, it showed that within the army there were sectors determined to stop the Republican direction by force. This coup attempt was followed by a progressive underground conspiracy in key garrisons, while in parallel the unions promoted increasingly radicalized strikes. The country was becoming a board where each movement generated an immediate response from the opposing side, leaving no room for consensus. In 1933, the situation reached a turning point. The November elections brought victory to the right, grouped around José María Gil Robles's CEDA, which supported a government headed by Alejandro Lerroux. The new conservative bloc sought to halt, if not reverse, several reforms promoted by the Republican Socialist coalition. The left interpreted this shift as a betrayal of the spirit of the Republic, while the right saw it as a necessary rescue from what they considered revolutionary excesses. The streets became a symbolic battlefield. Mass rallies, protest marches, and counter-demonstrations frequently ended in clashes, injuries, and in some cases, deaths. In October 1934, an insurrection broke out that solidified the idea that Spain was entering a period of increasing violence. The entry of the CEDA into the government triggered the so-called Asturian Revolution, a revolt promoted by socialists, communists, and anarchists. The insurrection was crushed by the army under the command of General Franco, resulting in thousands of deaths and harsh repression that left deep political wounds. In Catalonia, President Luis Companys proclaimed the Catalan state within the Spanish Federal Republic, a symbolic gesture quickly suppressed. The message for many sectors was clear: neither the right nor the left was willing to accept certain decisions of the adversary through democratic means. After the insurrection, the right-wing government implemented repressive measures and cutbacks that intensified working-class resentment. Many union leaders were imprisoned, while in numerous towns mass arrests were carried out. At the same time, extreme right action groups, such as the Phalangists, began to increase their attacks on leftist militants. Labor organizations responded with boycotts, strikes, and selective attacks, creating a climate of daily political violence. The streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Zaragoza, and Seville became frequent scenes of shootings and assaults. In 1935, the Lerroux government was weakened by corruption scandals, paving the way for new elections. Those of February 1936 would prove decisive for the country's fate. During the campaign, tensions intensified to unprecedented levels. Inflammatory speeches, mass rallies guarded by hundreds of militiamen, cross threats, and a climate in which each bloc viewed the other not as a democratic rival but as an existential enemy. The press, heavily politicized, aggravated the situation. Right-wing newspapers warned of the danger of a Bolshevization of Spain, while left-wing media denounced the fascist threat represented by the CEDA and the Phalange. The election results gave victory to the Popular Front, a left-wing coalition including Republicans, Socialists, Communists, and related groups. The government released the prisoners of the 1934 revolution and resumed the reform program. But far from pacifying the atmosphere, polarization worsened. The Spanish countryside witnessed a wave of land occupations by unemployed peasants. In the cities, confrontations between phalangists and leftist militants became almost daily. In some rural towns, de facto governments were established that ignored official authorities, while in others, civil guards and right-wing militants responded with violence. Between February and July 1936, Spain plunged into a spiral of political assassinations. According to historical counts, more than 200 deaths linked to partisan violence occurred during those months. One of the most serious cases was the assassination of Assault Guard Lieutenant José Castillo, a socialist sympathizer, followed by the kidnapping and killing of José Calvo Sotelo, a monarchist leader. This last event had a decisive impact. Sectors of the army believed that the government had lost control and that violence had become a tolerated political tool. Many indecisive officers began to lean toward the conspiracy that had been forming for months. At the same time, generals such as Mola, Franco, Goded, and Queipo de Llano secretly coordinated a military uprising intended to restore what they called order and halt both labor agitation and the advance of the left. The Republic, for its part, tried to maintain institutional control amid growing social pressure. Civil governors warned of the impossibility of containing violence, while unions denounced police repression and the actions of fascist groups. In this context, any incident could ignite a final spark, and the military conspiracy advanced, convinced that the situation was unsustainable. By mid-July 1936, tension had reached its peak. The last weeks were marked by general strikes in various provinces, attempted attacks on local authorities, and armed clashes between left and right-wing groups. The Falange increased its clandestine activity after the organization was banned, while labor unions continued arming themselves in preparation for a possible confrontation. The general sentiment was that the Republic was on the verge of collapse and that the country was heading toward a violent outcome. In this atmosphere of fear, resentment, and suspicion, the military conspirators set the date for their uprising. At dawn on July 17th in Melilla, the first move of the coup that sought to change Spain's destiny took place, and that attempt, meant to be swift and decisive, would evolve into a much longer and devastating conflict. The coup d'état of July 17, 1936. The military uprising that broke out on July 17, 1936, did not emerge spontaneously, but rather from a conspiracy that had been maturing for months, even years, within the most conservative circles of the army. After the Popular Front's victory in February, several high-ranking officers began coordinating more urgently, perceiving institutional disorder that threatened the country's integrity. In ships, barracks, and consulates, officers exchanged coded messages, verbal agreements, and plans that ranged from replacing the government to installing an authoritarian regime. The Spanish Military Union, a clandestine organization of conservative officers, became a center of operations that wove a network encompassing garrisons in Navarre, Africa, Galicia, Seville, and Zaragoza. General Emilio Mola, stationed in Pamplona, was the key figure in coordination. Under the codename The Director, he drafted a plan seeking a simultaneous uprising throughout the territory, ensuring that speed and surprise would prevent an organized government response. His idea was to execute a surgical, brief coup capable of disabling the Republic's loyal forces within hours. In his secret instructions, Mola made clear the need for immediate and forceful repression once the movement began, convinced that only through terror could a new order be imposed. This repressive component would be decisive in the conflict's later development. Francisco Franco, then military commander in the Canary Islands, initially hesitated to join the conspiracy. Although he shared Mola's assessment of the situation's gravity, he feared the operation would fail without sufficient support. However, Calvo Sotelo's assassination and rising street violence convinced him that the Republic had reached a point of no return. To avoid detection, he simulated institutional loyalty while sending coded messages to the conspirators. His role would prove crucial thanks to his control over the Army of Africa, the most disciplined and experienced forces in the country. In Morocco, the Legion and the Regulares were prepared to act quickly. There, Colonel Juan Yagüe, one of the most radical officers in the army, would play a key role in the early stages of the coup. The close relationship between Africanist officers and Franco allowed orders to circulate with great precision. In the peninsula, another indispensable figure was General José Sanjurjo, exiled in Portugal since 1934. The conspirators regarded him as the ideal political and military leader to head the new regime, although he would never assume that role. The pre-uprising atmosphere was one of great uncertainty. The Republican government, led by Santiago Casares Quiroga, received contradictory reports about suspicious maneuvers in several barracks. Although some ministers demanded stronger action, Casares Quiroga hesitated, fearing that a preventive reaction would accelerate what he wished to avoid. The executive knew that certain sectors of the army sympathized with the right, but it ignored the true scope of the conspiracy. The assault guard and the civil guard were divided, and many civil governors lacked the authority or resources to control the situation. On July 12th, Calvo Sotelo's assassination alarmed the conspirators. For them, the crime was proof of the collapse of public order and justified an imminent coup. Mola sent final instructions ordering the rebellious garrisons to be ready within 5 days. This decision accelerated preparations. In Pamplona, Carlist recrutés gathered to support the uprising. In Seville, contacts with right-wing civilians were finalized. In Zaragoza, General Cabanellas prepared his troops, and in Galicia, conservative-aligned military commanders awaited the exact moment to act. On the morning of July 17th in Melilla, a group of Africanist officers decided to move ahead a few hours before the original plan. They feared that growing rumors would provoke a government response that might jeopardize the coup's success. At 5 in the afternoon, the Melilla regiment revolted, detained Republican authorities, and declared a state of war. Within hours, Ceuta and Tetuan joined the uprising. Radio stations in Morocco broadcast the news, and the rebellion spread quickly throughout the protectorate. The government, surprised by the speed of events, tried to react, but information arrived in fragments. That same night, Franco made a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. From the Canary Islands, he sent a telegram announcing his adherence to the coup and traveled to the Cape Juby archipelago to assume command of the Army of Africa. On July 18th, he broadcast a manifesto justifying the uprising as a patriotic act meant to save Spain from chaos. His words sought to create the impression of an orderly and unified movement, although in reality the uprising was unfolding unevenly. In the peninsula, the garrisons reacted with mixed results. In Navarre, the coup triumphed immediately thanks to massive Carlist support. The same occurred in Galicia, Burgos, Salamanca, and part of Andalusia, where Capo de Llano seized Seville through a combination of cunning, intimidation, and brutal initial repression. In Castile and Leon, the rebels managed to control almost all major cities, consolidating a key territorial bloc for the war's later development. However, in Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and Bilbao, the reaction was different. The resistance of forces loyal to the Republic and labor mobilization thwarted the rebels' plans. In Madrid, the Director General of Security ordered the distribution of weapons to labor organizations once it became clear that several garrisons were rising up. Socialist, communist, and anarchist militias quickly seized factories, barracks, and strategic buildings. Rebel troops were neutralized in most critical points, allowing the capital to remain in Republican hands. In Barcelona, the CNT and the FAY played a decisive role. After hours of street fighting, anarchist militias stormed the rebellious barracks and defeated the insurgent forces, securing control of the city. In other regions, the situation was more confusing. In Aragon and Extremadura, some garrisons hesitated until the last moment. In Valencia, the uprising failed thanks to the combined action of the assault guard and the unions in Malaga, Granada, and Córdoba. Control was disputed street by street with differing results depending on the city. The final outcome of these initial days was a country split in two, with a fracture line not necessarily corresponding to historical divisions, but rather to each side's speed of reaction and the loyalty of military units. Meanwhile, in the Moroccan Protectorate, the Army of Africa reorganized under Franco's command. The Legion and the Regulares had a decisive advantage: discipline, mobility, and firepower superior to most peninsular units. Their transfer to the peninsula, however, was a challenge. The Republican government controlled most of the fleet, making it difficult to cross the strait. It was in this context that Germany and Italy began to intervene decisively, providing planes to transport Franco's troops and ensuring that the Army of Africa could quickly join the war. The uprising, intended to be swift and forceful, turned into a prolonged confrontation. The partial failure of the coup created an unexpected scenario for the conspirators. Instead of taking power in a matter of hours, they found themselves trapped in a war of positions. The Republican government, weakened but still functional, tried to reorganize its forces, while the rebel military consolidated key territories. In various towns, civilians joined the fight en masse, forming militias and turning cities into improvised battlefields. The country thus entered an open conflict whose early battles would mark a before and after. And it would be precisely this initial division, with its improvised defenses, disorganized militias and hurried military maneuvers, that would give way to the full outbreak of armed confrontation. The division of the country and the outbreak of the conflict. When the coup stopped being a military maneuver and became an open confrontation, Spain found itself divided into two territories that did not respond solely to geographic logic, but to the speed, forcefulness, and loyalty with which different garrisons reacted during the first days. On July 18th and 19th, 1936, while some cities fell under rebel control with almost no resistance, others improvised defenses to halt the military advance and maintain republican legality. This initial fragmentation determined the structure of the conflict. The Republic kept most major urban and industrial centers, while the rebels took control of wide rural areas in the interior and the north, as well as strategic corridors for future military operations. The resulting map was not static, but dynamic and changing. In the north, the Nationalists secured Navarra, Castilla y León, and Galicia, creating a continuous strip that allowed them to coordinate operations through conservative territories with well-armed traditionalist groups such as the Carlist Requetés. In contrast, the Republic maintained control of Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, and most of the Mediterranean coast, which guaranteed access to the sea, vital industries, and a mobilized urban base. Andalusia was split. Sevilla, Cadiz, and Córdoba fell on the nationalist side, while Malaga and Jaén remained Republican. Aragon was divided irregularly, and Extremadura became a contested corridor, key to connecting or isolating entire regions. In many towns and cities, the reaction did not depend solely on military presence, but on the local political balance. In places where left-wing unions and parties were strongly established, the population mobilized quickly, erecting barricades, attacking rebel barracks, and arming themselves with anything available, seized weapons, agricultural tools, and even dynamite from nearby mines. In cities like Madrid and Barcelona, popular pressure was decisive. The working masses prevented rebel forces from taking key positions, halting their initial offensive. In contrast, in Burgos, Salamanca, or Valladolid, the widespread sympathy for the right allowed the rebels to consolidate control with hardly any popular resistance. The Republic, surprised by the scope of the uprising, had to reorganize its forces urgently. The government, aware that a large part of the army had joined the coup or was internally divided, authorized the distribution of weapons to workers' organizations. Thus emerged the first militias, improvised columns of anarchists, socialists, communists, and republicans marching toward the most vulnerable fronts. Their enthusiasm partially compensated for their lack of military discipline, but this spontaneity also created problems of coordination, logistics, and command, which would become evident in the following weeks. Meanwhile, the rebels consolidated a unified command. From Burgos, which quickly became the de facto capital of the nationalist side, General Mola directed operations in the north. In Sevilla, Capo de Llano used a combination of radio propaganda, terror, and military actions to expand his control through western Andalusia. Franco, after crossing the strait thanks to the airlift facilitated by Germany and Italy, set out to link the protectorate with the peninsula, which would make the Army of Africa a decisive force for the nationalists' next advances. The clash between these two dynamics, improvised militias on one side and professional troops on the other, shaped the first fronts of the war. The rebels' immediate objective was to advance toward Madrid, convinced that the fall of the capital would bring down the Republic. To do so, they needed to cross regions still in dispute: Extremadura, Castilla-La Mancha, and part of Andalusia. The Republic, in turn, sought to reorganize its defenses and regain control of areas where the uprising had succeeded. The result was a series of advances and setbacks that, within weeks, turned the country into a vast and shifting battlefield. In Extremadura, Republican columns from Madrid and Valencia attempted to stop the advance of the African troops. The militias, however, lacked heavy weapons and military discipline, which made them vulnerable to the regulares and legionnaires, trained for fast and forceful combat. Villafranca de los Barros, Mérida, and Badajoz became scenes of confrontations that revealed the brutality of the conflict. The capture of Badajoz in August 1936, commanded by Yagüe, resulted in one of the war's most remembered massacres and secured a strategic connection between the north and south of rebel territory. In the north, the Basque Country and Asturias remained loyal to the Republic but isolated from the central zone. To retain control, they organized defense councils and mobilized both workers' militias and disciplined battalions, aware of their precarious situation. Basque industry, especially its arms factories, became crucial for sustaining the Republican war effort. In Asturias, miners, experienced in the use of explosives since the 1934 uprising, played a key role in defending access to the region. In Catalonia, the popular victory over the rebel military opened space for a social revolution that transformed both urban and rural life. Factories, transportation, and land were collectivized by anarchists and socialists, creating an atmosphere of revolutionary euphoria that coexisted with military urgency. Catalan militia columns marched toward Aragon, intending to retake Zaragoza, one of the rebels' strongest strongholds. However, the lack of coordination between various political and military factions hindered these operations, which progressed slowly and with significant logistical difficulties. The Republican government underwent a process of accelerated transformation. The resignation of Casares Quiroga on July 19th, followed by that of Martínez Barrio, whose attempt to negotiate with the rebels failed within hours, culminated in the rise of José Giral, who made the critical decision to arm the people. Without that measure, the Republic would likely have been defeated within days, but the proliferation of autonomous militias also temporarily disrupted military command, creating a mosaic of forces with diverse loyalties and little centralized coordination. Meanwhile, the rebels moved toward creating a unified command structure. The death of Sanjurjo on July 20th, when the small plane that was to bring him from Portugal crashed shortly after takeoff, left a political leadership vacuum. Mola continued directing military operations, but Franco's growing prominence, along with his control of the Army of Africa and his early success in Sevilla, positioned him as an increasingly influential figure. This process would culminate months later when the Nationalists proclaimed him head of state and generalissimo, consolidating a single command that would have decisive consequences for the war. In Madrid, the situation was chaotic. Thousands of volunteers arrived at barracks asking for weapons, unions formed committees to control neighborhoods, stations, and factories, and the government tried to maintain a functional state structure while reorganizing an almost dismantled army. The first weeks were marked by constant rumors of imminent attacks, raids against alleged conspirators, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions carried out by uncontrolled groups, especially in the most turbulent days of the summer. The Nationalists, aware of the symbolic and strategic importance of the capital, focused their efforts on advancing from the south. After taking Badajoz, the Army of Africa continued toward Madrid, rapidly occupying towns and cities and applying immediate repression in every locality. This advance spread terror among the Republican population and produced a massive flow of refugees toward the major cities. Roads filled with families fleeing with only the essentials, while militias tried to improvise defenses in poorly equipped towns. In the Republican zone, the initial enthusiasm did not prevent the first signs of internal fragmentation. Anarchists, communists, socialists, and Republicans had different views on how to organize defense, distribute weapons, and structure the rear guard. This lack of unity would become evident in later episodes, but even in these early weeks it was already hindering military coordination. Even so, working-class mobilization prevented the Nationalists from taking Madrid in a quick strike, forcing a prolonged war. The country was thus divided into two zones with political, economic, and military systems that began diverging sharply. In the Nationalist zone, military juntas and a centralized command combining conservative tradition, Catholicism, and strict discipline were established. In the Republican zone, a complex mix emerged: a weakened state, popular militias, and revolutionary experiments, especially in Catalonia and Aragon. This divergence would shape the evolution of the war and create internal tensions with decisive consequences. International intervention. The Spanish Civil War, from its earliest weeks, ceased to be a purely internal conflict and became a stage where European powers projected their ideologies, strategic interests, and fears about the political future of the continent. What had begun in July 1936 as a military uprising against a legitimate government immediately turned into a war laboratory where dictatorships and democracies tested their strength, tried out weapons, and measured the resistance of potential adversaries. European ideological polarization made Spain a testing ground for the tensions that would lead to the Second World War. The intervention of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy was decisive from the outset. Adolf Hitler, informed of the uprising through nationalist envoys and diplomatic contacts, saw in the Spanish conflict an exceptional strategic opportunity. Spain could become a key geographic ally, controlling the western access to the Mediterranean and providing a base to influence France. Moreover, the Führer viewed Spain as an ideal setting to test new aerial warfare tactics and refine weaponry that would later be used in Europe. Within days, Germany organized the dispatch of the first contingent of Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft to facilitate the airlift between Morocco and the peninsula, enabling the transfer of the Army of Africa, the backbone of Franco's forces. Shortly afterward, the first combat aircraft of the future Condor Legion arrived, an expeditionary force composed of pilots, technicians, and German anti-aircraft units. Although their presence was initially limited, their impact would be enormous. The Condor Legion not only provided air superiority for the Nationalists, but also introduced tactics that would change modern warfare: dive bombing, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, and trials of mixed squadron formations. For Hitler, Spain became a military school where the Luftwaffe could experiment without the diplomatic constraints a direct conflict with a major European power would entail. Mussolini's Italy, for its part, intervened with equal determination but with its own objectives. The Duce saw the Spanish conflict as an opportunity to expand his influence in the Western Mediterranean and demonstrate Italian supremacy within European fascism. Within weeks, Italy sent aircraft, light artillery, armored vehicles, and thousands of soldiers. The Corpo Truppe Volontarie, officially formed by volunteers but largely composed of regular military personnel, took part in major operations from 1937 onward and exceeded 70,000 troops throughout the conflict. Their presence was notable on key fronts such as Guadalajara and Malaga, although their military performance did not always match fascist ambition. German-Italian intervention was not limited to military aid. Both regimes sent advisors to reorganize the nationalist command structure, establish repressive practices, and coordinate propaganda. Foreign support allowed Franco to consolidate an image of strong leadership, paving the way for his later appointment as Generalissimo and head of state. The steady supply of weapons, fuel, ammunition, and specialized technicians ensured that the Nationalists maintained an accumulating advantage that would prove decisive as the war continued. Meanwhile, the Republic desperately sought help, aware that it could not face two fascist powers providing unlimited assistance to the rebels. However, it encountered an unfavorable diplomatic landscape. France, under the Popular Front government led by Léon Blum, sympathized ideologically with the Republican cause and initially considered sending weapons. But internal pressures and fear of triggering a wider European conflict led Paris to back down. The United Kingdom, guided by a policy of non-intervention intended to prevent a domino effect in Europe, strongly opposed any aid to the Republic and pressured France not to intervene. This stance, presented as neutrality, effectively favored the Nationalist side. In August 1936, the Non-Intervention Committee was created under British initiative, supposedly to prevent foreign powers from sending weapons to either side. More than 20 countries signed the agreement, but while Germany and Italy openly ignored the ban and continued sending arms, the committee became an obstacle for the Republic. Every attempt to acquire aircraft, tanks, or rifles was blocked, delayed, or confiscated in foreign ports. The international imbalance was evident. The Nationalists received direct, sustained, and well-organized support, while the Republic had to resort to clandestine channels, fragmented purchases, and complex diplomatic maneuvers. Faced with this blockade, the Soviet Union became the main ally of the Republican government. Stalin, though initially reluctant, decided to intervene when he realized that Franco's victory would strengthen Hitler and Mussolini. He also saw Spain as an ideal terrain to expand Soviet influence and test modern weaponry. In October 1936, the first shipments of T-26 tanks, Polikarpov aircraft, and Soviet military advisors arrived. These specialists played a crucial role in reorganizing the Republican Army, turning scattered militias into more disciplined and coordinated units. Although Soviet aid never matched the scale of Nazi-fascist support, it enabled the Republic to resist for years, especially in its most critical moments. Soviet intervention was accompanied by the arrival of the International Brigades, a unique phenomenon in contemporary history. From Paris, the Comintern promoted the formation of volunteer units from dozens of countries: France, Germany, Italy, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and even Latin America. Thousands of men and women, motivated by anti-fascism, revolutionary idealism, or the desire to halt Hitler's advance in Europe, traveled clandestinely across the Pyrenees to join the fight. The first brigades, formed in the autumn of 1936, played a fundamental role in the defense of Madrid and became an international symbol of resistance. However, Soviet aid was not free of internal tensions. The Communist Party of Spain, strengthened by its relationship with Moscow, adopted a strategy of military centralization and strict discipline that clashed with anarchists and socialists of more decentralized leanings. The USSR also used its influence to shape internal Republican politics according to its interests, provoking tensions that would erupt violently during the events of May 1937 in Barcelona. This political dimension of foreign aid had profound effects on the course of the war. Meanwhile, other countries maintained ambiguous positions. Portugal, under Salazar's dictatorship, collaborated covertly with the Nationalists, allowing the transit of weapons and volunteers and sending a few thousand viriatos, combatants who formally acted as volunteers, but in practice received state support. Mexico, on the other hand, became one of the few countries that openly supported the Republic, sending weapons, supplies, and receiving thousands of exiles. Its assistance, though limited compared to the Soviet contribution, had important symbolic value and helped sustain a government increasingly isolated. The war thus became an internationalized conflict in which the major powers of the 20th century participated directly or indirectly. The Nationalists received constant, coordinated, and massive support from Germany and Italy. The Republic depended on the USSR and the International Brigades, while Western democracies maintained a neutrality that in practice further unbalanced the conflict. This inequality in resources, advisors, and logistics would soon become evident in the major military operations beginning around Madrid, which would define the pace of the war. As the conflict progressed, foreign presence ceased to be an external element and became an integral part of both sides' strategies. Spain's skies filled with German, Italian, and Soviet aircraft. The fronts were populated with tanks and artillery whose models anticipated those of the future World War. Cities endured massive bombings designed to break civilian morale. The Spanish Civil War thus became the direct prelude to the global confrontation that would erupt in 1939. The Battle for Madrid. When the columns of the Army of Africa advanced toward the capital in mid-October 1936, Madrid became the absolute symbol of Republican resistance and the most ambitious strategic objective of the rebels. The city, with more than 1 million inhabitants, was the political, administrative, and emotional center of the Republic. Its fall would likely have caused the immediate collapse of the government and possibly a swift victory for the coup. But what Franco expected to be a decisive and brief operation turned into one of the longest, bloodiest, and most significant urban battles of the 20th century. The Nationalist advance toward Madrid began after the fall of Toledo, where the relief of the Alcázar provided Franco with a propaganda triumph of enormous impact. From that moment on, the Generalissimo concentrated his efforts on taking the capital. The route opened from the southwest, and the legionary and regular troops advanced with discipline that contrasted with the improvised resistance of Republican militias. In towns like Navalcarnero, Móstoles, and Talavera, the legionaries implemented a policy of terror intended to sow fear and break any resistance before the siege of Madrid. In the capital, the situation was chaotic, but the popular spirit had not weakened. Aware of its vulnerability, the government decided to transfer to Valencia on November 6th, a controversial move that left the Madrid Defense Council as the main authority in the city. Led by General José Miaja, the council coordinated defense efforts together with the newly created 5th Regiment, a model unit organized by the communists that imposed military discipline in an environment where militias still operated with informal structures. The slogan, "They shall not pass," pronounced by Dolores Ibarruri La Pasionaria, became a unifying cry and a symbol of the will to resist. The arrival of the International Brigades marked a turning point in the defense. In mid-November, the 12th and 11th Brigades, composed of French, German, Polish, Italian and Balkan volunteers, entered Madrid marching down Gran Via amid applause, flags, tears and cheers. For many inhabitants, seeing thousands of foreigners willing to fight and die for the Republican cause was an enormous moral boost. Although their military experience varied, their discipline and cohesion brought a much-needed sense of professionalization to the city. The first major nationalist attack focused on the Casa de Campo and the Manzanares River, seeking to break through toward the heart of the city. For days, legionaries and regular troops launched intense assaults on Republican lines. The battles at the Puente de los Franceses became one of the most iconic episodes of the early siege. Frontal attacks under crossfire, positions changing hands several times a day, and continuous bombings that turned buildings and parks into piles of rubble. The International Brigades, along with 5th Regiment units, managed to halt the attackers at the cost of many casualties. Unable to break the Western Front, Franco redirected the attack toward the university city, an area then under urban development with many buildings under construction that were transformed into defensive positions. From late November onward, the battle took on an intensely urban character. Faculties, hospitals, residence halls, and university corridors became improvised trenches. Combatants fought classroom by classroom, staircase by staircase, using desks as barricades and underground passageways as communication routes. The Casa de Velázquez, the Clínico, and the Faculty of Medicine witnessed particularly fierce fighting where gains were measured in mere meters. The Nationalists expected the material and tactical superiority of the Army of Africa to be decisive in an urban environment, but reality proved different. Narrow streets, ruined buildings, and Republican determination cancelled out their initial advantage. The African columns found themselves exposed to sniper fire, surprise counterattacks, and ambushes in which militias, familiar with the terrain, made use of every corner. The war of attrition favored the Republic, which received new reinforcements and was better positioned to defend inside the city than to launch external offensives. Propaganda played a central role during those days. Capo de Llano broadcast daily radio speeches from Sevilla, predicting the imminent fall of Madrid and issuing threats against the population. In response, Republican radio exalted the resistance and celebrated every counterattack, no matter how small. This psychological war sought to break the opponent's morale, but in Madrid it had the opposite effect. The city resisted with an almost ritual sense of defiance, becoming a symbol of international anti-fascism. July 1936 had shown that the Republic was capable of mobilizing the masses to stop a coup. November of that same year revealed that it could also withstand an organized military offensive. The Madrid Defense Council improved coordination and began gradually integrating the militias into a popular army, while the communists pushed to establish strict military discipline across all fronts. This reorganization, although still incomplete, helped stabilize defenses. Franco, facing the failure of a direct assault, decided to encircle the city gradually. Between December 1936 and January 1937, the Nationalists launched offensives toward the La Coruña Road and the Jarama River, aiming to cut Madrid's connections with the rest of Republican territory. The attack along the La Coruña Road was halted after fierce fighting in El Pardo and Majadahonda, where Republican lines held at great cost. The Battle of Jarama, which broke out in February 1937, was even bloodier. For weeks, the Nationalists attempted to cut the Valencia Road, the Republic's main supply route. The intervention of the International Brigades, particularly the 15th Brigade, stopped the advance, though at an extremely high human cost. At the same time, another nationalist operation, this time supported by the Italian Corpo Truppe Volontarie, failed in Guadalajara in March 1937. The Italian defeat had not only military repercussions, but also significant propaganda effects. It showed that fascist forces were not invincible and boosted Republican morale. However, these defensive victories did not change the strategic reality. Madrid remained under siege, isolated from the Republican north and subjected to constant bombardment. Daily life for Madrid's inhabitants during the winter of 1936 to 1937 was an exercise in survival. Air raid shelters were improvised in basements, metro stations, and railway tunnels. Food was scarce and strict rations were imposed. While fighting continued in the university city, residents carried on with their routines as much as possible. Children attended improvised schools, the sick were transported under artillery fire, and entire families moved through the city amid ruins, smoke, and constant alarms. Madrid's resistance, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of civilians, became one of the most admired elements of the Republican war effort. Franco, unable to break the defense but determined to maintain pressure, opted for a prolonged siege. His strategy relied on gradually isolating the city and wearing down its defenders, confident that nationalist material superiority would eventually prevail. The Republic in turn transformed the defense of Madrid into a political and moral symbol, aware that its fall would have devastating effects both on the war and on the international perception of the conflict. The major military campaigns. After the resistance of Madrid in November 1936, the war entered a phase of large-scale military campaigns that would define the evolution of the conflict. Both sides understood that the capital, although symbolically central, would not fall through a quick frontal assault. For this reason, the objective became the gradual destruction of the enemy's military capacity in open fronts, where mobility, heavy weaponry, and logistics would be determining factors. Between 1937 and 1938, some of the bloodiest and most extensive battles of the war took place. Jarama, Guadalajara, Brunete, Teruel, and the decisive Battle of the Ebro. These battles revealed the growing professionalization of the Republican Popular Army, but also the accumulation of resources, discipline, and air superiority of the nationalist side. The Battle of Jarama in February 1937 was the first major nationalist offensive to cut the Madrid-Valencia road, the main supply route to the capital. After the failure in the Casa de Campo and the university city, Franco sought to surround Madrid from the southeast. Nationalist troops advanced with initial speed, occupying elevated positions and directly threatening communication between Madrid and the rest of the Republican zone. However, resistance was fierce. The International Brigades, especially the 15th Brigade with the American Lincoln Battalion and British, Irish, and Balkan volunteers, played a key role in stopping the offensive. The Jarama Valley became a landscape of contested hills, burned olive groves, and riverbanks shattered by explosions. Hand-to-hand fighting, successive charges, and night counterattacks left thousands dead. Although the Nationalists conquered part of the terrain, they failed to cut the road and the front stabilized. Just a month later, the Battle of Guadalajara began, an operation in which the main role was played by the Italian Corpo Truppe Volontarie. Mussolini wanted a decisive and symbolic victory, convinced that his troops, superior in numbers and motorized equipment, would quickly defeat the Republican forces. The advance began under cold and humid weather that soon became a decisive factor. The Italians progressed initially, taking towns and secondary routes, but rain, mud, and fog severely affected their movements. When the Popular Army counterattacked, supported by Soviet T-26 tanks and well-coordinated units, the Italians were forced to retreat. The mechanized columns were trapped on muddy roads, turned into easy targets for Republican artillery. The defeat at Guadalajara was a strategic and propaganda blow for the Nationalists. For the first time, a fascist offensive was clearly defeated in open field. It also strengthened the Popular Army's confidence in its ability to resist and reorganize. The next major Republican operation took place in Brunete in July 1937. After months on the defensive, the Republic decided to take the initiative with an offensive intended to relieve pressure on Madrid by forcing the Nationalists to withdraw troops from the north. The operation began with a rapid advance. Republican forces took Brunette and several nearby towns, surprising the Nationalist positions. Tanks, anti-tank guns, and Republican aviation were deployed in coordination with Popular Army units more disciplined than in earlier phases of the war. However, the Nationalist counterattack was devastating. The Condor Legion, better equipped and with air superiority, systematically bombed Republican positions, while infantry and artillery units retook ground. The extreme summer heat, with temperatures above 40 degrees, caused massive dehydration, logistical failures, and exhaustion. Although the Republic demonstrated offensive capability, Brunete resulted in tremendous attrition that weakened some of its most valuable units without achieving a lasting strategic shift. At the end of 1937, one of the hardest and most symbolic campaigns of the war would unfold, the Battle of Teruel. The city, located in a strategic area between Aragon and the plateau, was in Nationalist hands and represented a potential link point for attacking Valencia. The Republican government, pressured by the fall of the North, where Bilbao had capitulated in June and Santander in August, needed a significant victory. Teruel seemed the right target, isolated, with a limited garrison and in a region difficult for reinforcements to reach. The attack began in December 1937, in the middle of winter. Republican troops advanced through blizzards, ice, and temperatures that reached 20 degrees below zero. After fierce fighting, they managed to penetrate the city and surround the Nationalist garrison. General Reich resisted in several fortified buildings but finally surrendered on the 8th of January 1938. The first provincial capital captured by the Republic during the entire war. However, the joy was short-lived. Franco launched a massive counter-offensive a few days later. Nationalist troops arrived with reinforcements, heavy artillery, and continuous air support. The presence of the Condor Legion was decisive. Constant bombings turned Teruel into a sea of ruins, making any orderly defense impossible. Republican troops, exhausted, frozen, and short on supplies, slowly withdrew until the city fell again under Nationalist control in mid-February. The fall of Teruel had dramatic effects. Republican forces had suffered enormous losses in men, weaponry, and morale, and their ability to launch counteroffensives was seriously damaged. Franco, taking advantage of this, launched the Aragon offensive in March 1938. This operation split Republican territory in two. The Nationalists advanced from Zaragoza toward the Mediterranean, taking Lerida, Fraga, and eventually reaching Vinaros. The Republic was divided into two disconnected zones, the Central Zone and the Catalan Zone, representing a major strategic blow. In this critical context, the Republican government sought to launch one last major offensive that could change the course of the war. This operation would be the Battle of the Ebro, launched in July 1938. The objective was to force the Nationalists to divert troops eastward, relieve pressure on Valencia, and, if possible, regain territory in Catalonia. Thousands of soldiers of the Popular Army crossed the Ebro River in a carefully planned night operation. Improvised pontoon bridges, silent boats, and campaign bridges allowed Republican units to enter enemy territory before Nationalist aviation could detect them. The first hours were a success. Republican troops advanced and occupied several elevated positions, taking the Nationalists by surprise. However, Franco's reaction was immediate and brutal. Determined to prevent any significant advance, he ordered the concentration of artillery, aviation, and entire divisions to launch a direct counterattack. The Condor Legion bombed the Republican bridges, while Italian aviation attacked the newly captured positions. Fighting in the Pandols and Cavals mountain ranges was extremely intense. Trenches in ravines, snipers hidden among agricultural terraces, entire columns of exhausted soldiers advancing under the scorching summer sun of Catalonia. The Battle of the Ebro lasted more than 3 months, becoming the longest and bloodiest of the entire war. Day after day, the Popular Army resisted fiercely, but its resources were running out. Without air superiority or supplies comparable to those of the Nationalists, Republican units began to slowly lose ground. Bridges over the Ebro were rebuilt again and again, only to be destroyed once more by German and Italian bombings. When the last Republican soldier crossed back to the left bank of the river in late November 1938, the outcome was irreversible. The Republic had lost its last great military gamble: Guernica and the bombings against civilians. At the beginning of 1937, the Civil War had entered a phase in which aviation, until then secondary in European conflicts, began to gain unprecedented prominence. Both Germany and Italy used Spanish territory as a testing ground for aerial tactics that they would later apply in the Second World War. For the civilian population, this meant the emergence of a new type of violence: systematic bombings, dive attacks, and the destruction of entire cities from the air. Among all these episodes, the most emblematic and devastating would be the bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, immediately transformed into a universal symbol of modern terror. The Basque region was strategic for the Nationalists. After the fall of Madrid as an immediate objective, Franco concentrated his efforts on the northern front: Biscay, Santander, and Asturias. Basque industry was vital for the Republican war effort. In addition, its geographical isolation made sending reinforcements difficult. In this context, Guernica, a small city of great symbolic importance to the Basque people, was located near the front line. It was not an essential military target, but its destruction sought to break Basque morale and facilitate the advance on Bilbao. The Condor Legion and the Italian Legionary Aviation had intensified their operations in the north since March. The German command saw in Spain an opportunity to practice new tactics, especially the combination of carpet attacks and bombings in successive waves. Guernica presented itself as an ideal setting, a small city with wooden buildings connected by strategic bridges and located in a corridor that the Nationalists wished to control. The civilian population could not imagine the magnitude of the attack that was about to come. On Monday, April 26th, Market Day, hundreds of people crowded the streets of Guernica, coming from nearby towns. At 4:30 p.m., the first planes appeared in the sky: German Heinkel, He-111 and Dornier Do-17 bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. Their first action was to cut off the exits by bombing the access roads and highways. Immediately afterward came the second wave, with incendiary and explosive bombs falling at regular intervals designed to destroy buildings and cause massive fires. For more than 3 hours, the city was attacked without interruption. The combination of explosive and phosphorus bombs created an urban inferno. The wooden houses burned easily, the streets filled with smoke, shrapnel and rubble. Entire families were trapped under collapsed buildings. German fighters flying at low altitude strafed civilians fleeing into the open countryside, multiplying the panic. When the attack finally ended, Guernica was a smoking ruin. More than 70% of its buildings had been destroyed. The exact number of dead is still debated, but it is estimated that between 150 and 300 people lost their lives in a city that barely exceeded 6,000 inhabitants. The international impact was immediate. In London, Paris, and New York, newspapers published devastating images of the destruction. British journalist George Steer, present at the site shortly after the attack, wrote reports that revealed the truth about the bombing. Guernica had been deliberately attacked to terrorize the civilian population. His report, published in the Times and the New York Times, disproved the nationalist version, which tried to justify the destruction by attributing it to a supposed fire started by the Republicans themselves. That propaganda strategy failed. The evidence was too overwhelming. Guernica quickly became a universal symbol, consolidated soon after when Pablo Picasso, shocked by the news, painted his most famous work. Although the canvas is not part of the military conflict itself, its symbolic power amplified the international denunciation of the bombing. For millions of people, the painting represented the suffering of Spanish civilians and turned the Basque city into an icon of 20th century anti-militarism. But Guernica was not an isolated case. From the early months of the war, bombings against civilians had become a recurring tactic. In November 1936, the Condor Legion bombed Durango, causing hundreds of deaths. In Madrid, aerial attacks intensified during the siege. Between November 1936 and March 1937, the capital suffered the first systematic bombings of a European city. German and Italian planes dropped bombs on residential neighborhoods while Madrilenians ran to the metro shelters. For the first time in Europe, a major city lived under prolonged bombing intended to break civilian morale. In Barcelona, the situation was even more dramatic. In March 1938, Italian planes carried out a series of sustained bombings over several days, attacking densely populated areas without clear military targets. These attacks, considered among the first systematic terrorist bombings in history, destroyed entire blocks of the Example and left more than 1,000 dead. The international community reacted with outrage, but no European power intervened to stop the air operations. The policy of non-intervention continued to benefit the rebels, who enjoyed incomparable air support. The Republicans, for their part, also carried out bombings, though on a much smaller scale and with very limited resources. Republican aviation lacked the technical capacity to carry out prolonged or large-scale attacks. Even so, Soviet Katyuska bombers conducted operations over rebel-controlled cities such as Zaragoza or Seville. But the difference in intensity, frequency, and number of victims was enormous. While the Nationalists and their allies regularly attacked urban centers, Republican bombings were punctual, tactical, and comparatively limited in impact. The psychological dimension of aerial terror became decisive. In all attacked areas, civilians had to reorganize their daily lives around sirens, shelters, and nighttime blackouts. Underground shelters in Madrid and Barcelona became spaces where entire families spent nights under the roar of aviation. Cities began developing rudimentary anti-air defense systems, rooftop batteries, barrage balloons, smoke screens. But none of this could counter the technological superiority of the Condor Legion or the legionary aviation. Aerial warfare also transformed international perceptions of the conflict. In Europe and America, Guernica and the bombings of Barcelona were seen as a warning of what was to come. For diplomats and military observers, Spain became a disturbing mirror, a preview of the destroyed cities, displaced populations, and indiscriminate bombings that just a couple of years later would devastate London, Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Dresden. The Spanish Civil War not only revealed human suffering, but also anticipated the military logic of total war. Everyday life during the war. While major military operations advanced across Spain's fronts, the civilian population lived a parallel reality marked by shortages, fear, and constant adaptation to an environment that had left behind any sense of normality. The Spanish Civil War was not only a conflict between armies, it was, above all, a social drama that transformed customs, work, food, coexistence, and the very structure of daily life. In both the Republican and Nationalist zones, ordinary people had to reorganize every aspect of their existence according to the war, although internal dynamics in each zone led to different experiences. In the Republican zone, especially in large cities such as Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia, the massive arrival of refugees became one of the greatest social challenges. People from towns devastated by war or from areas threatened by nationalist offensives fled with whatever they could carry: blankets, cutlery, family photographs, clothing, train stations filled with exhausted families seeking improvised accommodation in schools, convents turned into shelters, and requisitioned public buildings. The demographic pressure increased scarcity, accelerated rationing, and forced the government to allocate limited resources to humanitarian assistance. Food supply became one of the most critical issues. In Madrid, during the siege, the queues in front of shops were endless. Ration cards set strict amounts of bread, oil, rice, or legumes, and even so, they were often insufficient. Families learned to stretch scarce ingredients through improvised substitutions. Soups made with nearly bare bones, chicory coffee, bread mixed with low-quality flours. At times, convoys arrived from Valencia or Almeria with provisions, but bombings and the destruction of roads complicated logistics. Women, mostly responsible for obtaining food, traveled through entire neighborhoods in search of black markets or vendors offering something beyond the official ration. In Barcelona, the experience was similar, though marked by the social revolution led by anarchists and socialists. During the early months of 1936, many shops were collectivized and public dining halls were organized where hundreds of people ate daily at minimal or no cost. The idea of a revolutionary economy coexisted with the practical difficulties of supplying food. The shortage of meat, milk, and sugar was chronic, and the Italian bombings of 1938 worsened the situation even further. Constant blackouts transformed the city into a landscape of shadows where families dined by candlelight and prepared to run to shelters at the sound of any siren. The situation in the countryside was also deeply transformed. In Republican zones, especially in Catalonia and Aragon, lands were collectivized, crops were reorganized, and agricultural cooperatives were created to try to guarantee production despite the mobilization of thousands of workers to the front. In some towns, the social revolution generated enthusiasm and solidarity. In others, it caused tensions between peasants who supported collectivization and those who defended private property. What everyone had in common was the difficulty of maintaining production in the midst of war and the inevitable requisitions by the army to feed the troops. Life in the Nationalist zone was no less harsh, although it took on different characteristics. Under Franco's control, the Nationalists established from the outset a regime of strict discipline, traditional social hierarchy, and Catholic morality. In cities such as Burgos, Salamanca, or Valladolid, daily life seemed more stable than in the Republican zone, but that stability was crossed by a permanent climate of repression. Any suspicion of Republican sympathy could lead to arrests, summary trials, or executions. Entire families lived in fear of anonymous denunciations, while the new Francois municipalities purged officials, teachers, and workers considered disaffected. Regarding food, the Nationalist zone also faced shortages, especially in the early months. However, by controlling extensive agricultural territories, the Nationalists had greater access to wheat, livestock, and basic products. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy sent food along with weapons, which helped sustain supplies in key regions. Even so, rationing existed, and in cities such as Seville or Zaragoza, long lines also formed to obtain bread, oil, or potatoes. Many families had to resort to bartering, clothes in exchange for chickens, furniture in exchange for corn, valuables traded for flour. Fear was a common denominator. Nationalist bombings over Madrid and Republican bombings over Zaragoza generated constant anxiety. In the Nationalist zone, public executions and forced disappearances created a climate of mandatory silence. In the Republican zone, the paseos and detentions carried out by uncontrolled groups, especially at the beginning of the war, spread uncertainty among sectors accused of sympathizing with the rebels. In both sides, the civilian population lived in a state of permanent vigilance. Repression in the rearguard took multiple forms. In the Nationalist zone, war councils were organized to judge teachers, journalists, union members, or peasants under charges of rebellion, Marxism, or atheism. In the Republican zone, the Checkers, improvised detention centers, were administered by militias or parties, and in them suspects of conspiracy were interrogated and, in some cases, executed. These dynamics were not identical in scale or organization, but they shared a central element. Daily life was permeated by politics, and any gesture could be interpreted as alignment with one side or the other. Education also suffered a radical transformation. In the Republican zone, many children attended classes in basements, shelters, or improvised courtyards. Teachers tried to maintain some normality, although each day could be interrupted by sirens or evacuations. Cultural campaigns were promoted to keep morale alive: mobile libraries, war theaters, and public readings. In the Nationalist zone, by contrast, education came under strict religious and military control. Subjects were infused with Francois propaganda and Catholic morality, and content was adjusted to promote obedience, patriotism, and discipline. Public health was severely affected. Overcrowded hospitals, shortages of medicine, and outbreaks of diseases such as typhus or tuberculosis were common in both zones. Women played a fundamental role as nurses, organizers of dining halls, and caretakers of refugees. Children, particularly vulnerable, suffered from malnutrition, respiratory illnesses, and psychological trauma caused by constant bombing. The Red Cross, humanitarian organizations, and foreign doctors tried to alleviate the crisis, but their impact was limited by the magnitude of the conflict. Despite everything, life went on. In Madrid, couples married in air raid shelters. In Barcelona, musicians organized clandestine concerts. In rural areas, peasants continued to farm under the risk of bombings. Creativity and resilience manifested in small gestures. Children's games in courtyards filled with sandbags, blankets sewn from recycled scraps, improvised recipes without basic ingredients. War imposed suffering, but it also strengthened community ties. In the Nationalist zone, repression and ideological control intensified as the conflict advanced. The church regained a central role in daily life. Processions, massive masses, and public confessions became part of the urban landscape. Meanwhile, in the Republican zone, political diversity generated internal tensions that would soon erupt with force, especially in Catalonia, where communists, socialists, and anarchists began to clash with one another. The internal struggle within the Republican side. As the war progressed and military difficulties multiplied, the Republican zone experienced a phenomenon that would prove as decisive as the nationalist offensives, the internal fracture among its own political forces. What had been a broad alliance at the outbreak of the conflict began to crack under the weight of ideological differences, military urgencies, and disputes over political control. The tensions, which had been kept relatively contained in the early months, erupted violently in Barcelona in May 1937, becoming one of the most dramatic episodes in the Republican rearguard. The origin of these tensions was profound. In Catalonia and parts of Aragon, the social revolution promoted mainly by the CNTFA had transformed economic and political life. Collectivized factories, lands worked in common, anarchist control patrols watching the streets, and an atmosphere dominated by the idea that the war had to go hand in hand with the revolution. The libertarian sectors believed that defeating Franco without radically transforming society was impossible. Therefore, they defended the autonomy of the militias and collectivization as essential tools to sustain the war effort. In contrast, the Communist Party of Spain and its Catalan counterpart, the PSUC, promoted a completely different vision. For them, the absolute priority was to win the war, and any profound social transformation had to be postponed. Admirers of Soviet discipline and backed by the USSR, the Communists pushed for the creation of a unified, hierarchical and professional army. The revolution, they argued, weakened military capability and generated disorder. Victory first, revolution later. The socialists were divided. One faction, led by Indalecio Prieto, agreed with the communists on the need for a centralized army. Another, following Largo Caballero, sympathized with the idea of coexisting with the social revolution, though with reservations. Meanwhile, the left-wing Republicans tried to maintain an institutional balance that was crumbling as the war intensified. In Catalonia, the Generalitat, presided over by Luis Companys, tried to coexist with the growing power of the anarchists, who had controlled much of the economy and public security since the summer of 1936. The Public Order Council was practically subordinated to the libertarian patrols, and state authority was, in many cases, symbolic. This duality of power constantly generated tensions between the autonomous government and the CNTFA, tensions that worsened when the Catalan communists began to gain influence thanks to Soviet support. By late 1936 and early 1937, the revolutionary character of Catalonia began to be questioned by the central Republican government. With Negrin as the new head of government, the communist line gained strength. The aim was to re-establish state authority, control the economy, and place the militias under central command. The communists obtained key positions within the security forces, especially in surveillance and investigative services. This reorganization met resistance from the anarchists, who saw it as an attempt to dismantle the revolution and subject Catalonia to centralist control. The most serious point of friction arose around one of Barcelona's strategic buildings, the telephone exchange. This building, located in Plaça de Catalunya, had been controlled by CNT militants since July 1936. Its importance was unquestionable. From there, the internal communications of the Catalan government were managed and calls from the central government in Valencia were monitored. For the anarchists, keeping control of it was an act of revolutionary sovereignty. For the government and the communists, it was a direct threat to military and political coordination. On May 3, 1937, the Public Order Councillor of the Generalitat, Eusebi Duncas, together with forces from the Mossos d'Esquadra and members of the PSUC, attempted to take the telephone exchange building. The poorly prepared operation immediately erupted into a shootout. The anarchist workers barricaded themselves, and the news spread like wildfire throughout the city. Within hours, Barcelona was divided by barricades. Anarchists, militants of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, and autonomous groups occupied streets, squares, and buildings. The PSUC, the Mossos, and government forces defended strategic areas of the Example and the city centre. For 5 days, the city experienced what many witnesses described as a war within the war. Communications were cut, collectivized factories suspended activities, entire groups of militiamen abandoned the Aragon front to return to Barcelona, convinced that the revolution was in danger. PSUC offices were attacked, anarchist radio stations called for resistance against Stalinist authoritarianism. POUM leaders denounced an attempt by Moscow to impose a Soviet model in Spain. Ideological tension became armed violence. The central government, alarmed, sent to Barcelona the Minister of the Navy and Air Force, Indalecio Prieto, and later carabineros and assault guards to restore order. Meanwhile, companies tried to mediate between the sides, aware that a total fracture would mean the collapse of Catalan resistance. Finally, on May 8th, a fragile agreement was reached. The anarchists removed some barricades, and the public order forces partially regained control of the city. But the damage was done. The political consequences were immediate. Largo Caballero, who had tried to maintain a balance among the various left-wing factions, was forced to resign on May 17th. His fall represented the definitive triumph of the communist line within the Republican government. Juan Negrín assumed office with a clear program: centralization of power, military discipline, and absolute coordination with the Soviet Union. For the anarchists, this was a devastating blow. For the POUM's Trotskyists, it marked the beginning of the end. Just 1 month later, in June, the POUM was declared illegal and its leader, Andreu Nin, arrested and later murdered. The internal repression, silent and carried out largely by intelligence services linked to the USSR, eliminated any attempt at revolutionary opposition within the Republican side. The events of May 1937 left deep wounds. Many anarchist militiamen who had fought since the first day of the coup felt betrayed by a government they considered surrendered to Soviet influence. The libertarian militias were forcibly integrated into the People's Army, losing their autonomy. In Catalonia, collectivization retreated in several sectors. The Aragon front, weakened by the chaotic demobilization caused by the events in Barcelona, became vulnerable to the nationalist offensives that would sweep through the region months later. Thus, the Republican side entered a phase marked by military discipline, but also by an emotional and political fracture difficult to overcome. Meanwhile, Franco took advantage of every internal weakening of the enemy to consolidate his own bloc. The iron unity of the nationalist side increasingly contrasted with the fractured mosaic of the Republic. Franco's final offensive. After the Republican defeat in the Battle of the Ebro at the end of 1938, the war entered its final phase. The People's Army had been left exhausted, decimated, and with scarce material resources. Catalonia, now one of the last solid territorial strongholds of the Republic, was isolated by land and sea, vulnerable to any major offensive. Franco, aware of this structural weakness, decided to concentrate all his military power in a massive operation aimed at destroying Catalan resistance and delivering an almost irreversible blow to the Republican effort. The final offensive began in December 1938, and in a few weeks transformed the structure of the conflict. The initial attack unfolded in the Segre and Ebro Basin regions, areas that had seen intense combat for months. The Nationalist forces, reinforced by heavy artillery, motorized units, and German and Italian aviation, advanced in disciplined columns that quickly broke through Republican lines. The People's Army, exhausted by the Ebro and without the capacity for effective reorganization, could offer only limited resistance. In the first days of January 1939, the Republican positions collapsed, forcing a premature and disorganized retreat into the interior of Catalonia. The fall of Lleida and its surrounding areas made it clear that Catalan resistance was collapsing. Nationalist aviation bombed every rail junction, road and bridge that could slow the advance. Entire cities were left without electricity, without communications, and without the possibility of organizing a broad defense. The Condor Legion carried out constant attacks on columns of refugees, military vehicles, and populations attempting to evacuate, repeating tactics already used in the north. The Republican columns, lacking fuel and ammunition, became scattered groups unable to confront the motorized divisions advancing from Aragon and Castile. The civilian exodus that followed was one of the most dramatic of the entire war. Hundreds of thousands of people fled toward the French border. Catalonia's roads collapsed under the weight of that human movement, while bombs fell only a few kilometers away. Testimonies describe overturned carts, abandoned suitcases, dead animals on the roads, burned-out vehicles, and long lines moving under winter rain without knowing whether they would reach the other side safely. It was a massive exodus that anticipated the imminent fall of the region. On January 15th, the Nationalists entered Tarragona after brief resistance. The city, exhausted and without supplies, fell quickly. The advance toward Barcelona accelerated. On January 22nd, Negrin and the main Republican leaders decided to abandon the Catalan capital due to its imminent fall. The Generalitat also moved toward the border. In Barcelona, a deep political vacuum remained, while thousands of citizens continued fleeing north in search of international protection. On January 26, 1939, nationalist troops entered Barcelona without significant opposition. The city, one of Spain's main industrial and cultural capitals, had endured bombings, starvation, and internal tensions for years. Now it came under Francois' control. The entrance was met with a mix of silence, fear, and resignation, interrupted by the celebrations of conservative sectors who had awaited the moment since July 1936. In the streets, Republican flags were torn from balconies while Francois' insignia were raised, and a new political and military order was imposed. After the fall of Barcelona, the offensive continued toward Girona and Figueres. The last meeting of the Republican Cortes took place in the Figueres castle under almost clandestine conditions and constant bombardment. In a matter of days, nationalist troops took the last Republican positions in Catalonia, pushing tens of thousands of refugees toward the border. On February 5, 1939, the last fighters crossed the Pyrenees. France, overwhelmed and unable to properly receive so many fugitives, interned most in improvised camps such as Argelès-sur-Mer, Saint-Cyprien, and Gurs. There, on beaches turned into open barracks, thousands of exiles lived under extreme conditions, exposed to cold, hunger, and disease. The fall of Catalonia left the Republic practically without international support. Western democracies officially recognized Franco's government at the end of February 1939. This diplomatic recognition marked a crucial turning point. The Republic, already militarily weakened, was now isolated internationally. The Soviet Union had significantly reduced its shipments of weaponry after the Ebro failure, while Mexico, its firmest ally, lacked the capacity to alter the course of the war. The remaining Republican territory, consisting of part of Levante, the Central Zone, and Madrid, was in a terminal situation. Morale was deeply deteriorated, supplies were scarce, and the People's Army had lost much of its operational capacity. In Valencia, Alicante, and Murcia, political disorder grew. Opposing factions debated whether to negotiate surrender, continue the war, or force a massive evacuation of leaders and combatants. In Madrid, the National Defense Council, led by Colonel Casado, criticized Negrin's government and accused it of prolonging a lost war. Within the Republican side, the idea of an internal coup to negotiate more lenient surrender conditions with Franco emerged. Casado, supported by moderate socialists, anarchists, and part of the army, launched the so-called Casado coup on March 5, 1939. This movement sought to depose Negrin and negotiate a separate peace. Fighting between pro-communist units and Casado's forces spread for days in Madrid, further worsening Republican disorganization. Negrin, sheltered at the Monova airbase, understood that the Republic had collapsed from within. The hope for prolonged resistance had evaporated. Franco, however, had no intention of negotiating. His goal was total and unconditional surrender. With Catalonia under control, his army advanced toward Levante and the Central Zone without meeting significant resistance. Each city that fell revealed the inevitable Republican defeat. Alicante, one of the last available ports, became crowded with thousands of refugees waiting for ships that never arrived. Many were detained by Francois forces and sent to improvised concentration camps. With its enemy divided, exhausted, and without international support, Franco ordered the final offensive toward Madrid, aware that the fall of the capital would be the definitive symbolic act of the war. The troops advanced relentlessly, occupying roads, towns, and strategic positions almost without opposition. The city that had heroically resisted since 1936 faced its military end in an atmosphere of silence, hunger, and political disillusionment. The end of the war, 1939. The end of the Spanish Civil War arrived amid a climate of political breakdown, military collapse, and social despair that had spread throughout the Republican zone after the fall of Catalonia. By early 1939, the Republic was already an isolated and fragmented territory with no capacity to withstand Franco's final offensive. The cities still under Republican control lived immersed in a mixture of resignation, internal anger, and fear of what was coming. The population had endured 3 years of bombings, famine, executions, and shortages. Hopes of receiving international aid had completely vanished, and the internal fracture caused by Casado's coup eliminated any possibility of organized resistance. After the defeat in Catalonia and the international recognition of Franco's regime by France and the United Kingdom, the Republic was left without significant support. The Soviet Union had withdrawn most of its advisors and halted the shipment of weapons, aware that defeat was inevitable and that a final effort would not change the outcome. Juan Negrin's government insisted on resisting to keep open the possibility that a European war, already nearly unavoidable, could alter the situation, but that hope was not shared by most of the People's Army, nor by the political forces within the Republican zone. Morale was broken and military discipline reduced to fragments. Colonel Casado's coup, initiated on March 5, 1939, accelerated the collapse. Fighting in Madrid between Casadista forces, supported by anarchists and moderate socialists and communist militants loyal to Negrin, was intense and brief. While the city confronted itself from within, Franco watched from a distance as his enemy destroyed itself. For the Republicans, there was no longer a unified command nor a common project. The logic of civil war had penetrated even their own ranks. In this context, tens of thousands of civilians desperately sought to leave the country. After the closing of the French border in February and its limited reopening only to political refugees, the Mediterranean ports, Alicante, Valencia, and Cartagena, became the last escape points. In Alicante, more than 15,000 people waited for days for ships that never arrived, trapped between the fear of the Nationalist advance and the reality that there were no longer any safe escape routes. Many ended up detained and sent to François concentration camps or overcrowded prisons where purging processes were immediate. The retirada had begun months earlier, during the massive exodus that led nearly 500,000 people to cross the Pyrenees between January and February 1939. The fall of Barcelona had triggered an unprecedented human collapse. Entire families, disarmed militiamen, defeated soldiers, political leaders, intellectuals and workers fled toward France under a harsh winter, watched from the air by François aviation and pursued by columns advancing without pause. The road toward Le Perthus and Bourg-Madame became a corridor of anguish. Overturned carts, exhausted crying children, elderly people leaning on improvised canes, women pushing belongings in wheelbarrows, and thousands trying to move forward despite the cold, snow and lack of food. France, overwhelmed by the volume of refugees, improvised internment camps along its Mediterranean coast. The most well-known, such as Argelès-sur-Mer, Saint-Cyprien and Gurs, were hastily built, lacking adequate facilities and with scarce resources. The beaches of Argelès, exposed to freezing winds and with nothing but wooden barracks or tents for shelter, became one of the symbols of the Republican exile. Thousands of refugees remained there for weeks or months, sleeping on frozen sand with minimal food rations, insufficient medical services, and guarded by French colonial soldiers who did not know how to handle such a mass of exhausted and traumatized people. Children suffered the most. Infectious diseases such as typhus or dysentery spread rapidly. Women tried to organize improvised collective kitchens while men debated their immediate future, returning to Spain under uncertain promises, emigrating to other countries, or waiting for a larger conflict in Europe that might reverse their situation. Some would later be transferred to camps in inland France, others incorporated into forced labor companies, and several ended up becoming prisoners of the Nazis after the German invasion of 1940. Meanwhile, in Spain, Franco advanced without resistance. After the fall of Levante on March 26, 1939, Nationalist troops began their final entry into Madrid. The city, which had resisted 3 years of sieges, bombings, and privations, no longer had real defensive capacity. Casado's Defense Council had attempted to negotiate an honorable capitulation, but Franco rejected any agreement other than total and unconditional surrender. For him, the war could not end with compromises. It had to conclude with the absolute victory of the new state and the elimination of any vestige of the Republican regime. On March 27th, Francois units entered the outer neighborhoods of Madrid without encountering opposition. The population, exhausted, watched from windows and balconies the advance of military columns that represented the end of 3 years of devastation. There was silence, fear, and some isolated applause, especially in areas where conservative sectors had awaited the arrival of the rebels. But for the most part, the city witnessed the end of the war in a state of resignation. On March 28th, Madrid officially fell. That same day, mass arrests began, purges of civil servants, confiscations, and strict controls in stations and public buildings. The advance toward the last Republican cities was immediate. There were no significant battles. Within a few days, the entire Republican zone was under Franco's control. On April 1st, 1939, Franco signed the last war report. The communiqué, brief and forceful, announced, "The Red Army has been captured and disarmed. The national troops have achieved their final military objectives." With that sentence, broadcast by radio throughout the country, the Spanish Civil War was officially declared over, a conflict that had lasted nearly 3 years and left a devastated territory, a traumatized population, and a massive exile that would shape the country's history for decades.